Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
People throughout the world are afraid today that what they don't know about what's going on in the Soviet Union might hurt them. There are a lot more questions about the Chernobyl accident, nuclear accident, than there are answers at this point. We're going to try to raise the questions, perhaps discuss some possible answers here on Public Affairs Roundtable today. Our guest, Ruth Howes, professor of physics department, who last year worked for Arms Control and Disarmament Agency in Washington, D.C., talked to us about some of the nuclear technology, the dangers and potential there. Alice Bennett, a professor in the biology department with expertise in the biological implications and radiation concerns people have, and John Rouse from political science. What happened, Ruth? Do we know exactly what happened? Obviously, there's some common ground that all nuclear reactors are somehow alike, and the same sorts of things can go wrong with them. Is that right?
This is true. The exact details of what started the accident, how it began, nobody knows. You'll remember that when 3 Mile Island happened in this country, we didn't know for some days exactly how the accident started. We do know that it ended with a core meltdown.
And what is a core meltdown?
After there is radioactivity trapped in the rods of a nuclear reactor, so that even after you've cut off the nuclear fission reaction, this radioactivity makes the core actually melt into a pool of molten liquid.
That releases radiation?
That's right. If something carries the radiation up, it boils out of the pool of molten liquid. And according to the press, the Soviets nearly lost control of the pool of molten liquid. It almost ate down into the groundwater under the reactor, which would have been an even more major disaster than the disaster they currently are dealing with.
Alice, are we talking about a disaster in terms of radiation release, in terms of, I guess, the effects on human life?
You mean from a biological viewpoint?
From a biological viewpoint.
I think that's one of the really big question marks. We know a lot about the effect of radiation on living things, on humans. We've done lots of experiments on this. The problem is that it's all a matter of probability. We speak, for example, about an LD 50 over 60, meaning half of the people exposed to this dose will die within 60 days. So to say that it's going to have a specific effect on a specific individual is very difficult. But with the amount of radiation, at least the numbers that I'm hearing, it sounds like we're looking more at late effects, longer-term effects, cancer production, these sorts of things.
Within the area of the reactor, or perhaps 800 miles away in Stockholm, or halfway around the world?
Those are the kinds of questions that I think are very difficult to answer. But I think the biologists agree that any increase in levels of radiation can have a negative effect on an organism, which means that anytime that you have fallout, it depends on the kind of isotope. Iodine, radioactive iodine, accumulates in the thyroid. Radioactive strontium accumulates in the bone. So it's not just the total amount of activity, it's which kind. And when you're looking at a radioactive effect on an individual. So I'd say, yeah, I think that we're looking at possibilities or probabilities of increased radiation effects in these areas.
In any case, it can have no positive effect on life. Right?
That's right.
John Rouse, this tells us something about the Soviet Union. The reaction, the release or non-release of information. Is this typical? Does this say the Soviet Union is, in fact, a secretive society?
Yeah, Larry, I was just thinking in terms of some of the comments of Alice talking about probabilities and possibilities. I think, and of course the technology is very complicated for most of us. One thing we know about the Soviet Union and their probability for patterns in the past is that it's not probable, it's indeed there. The first thing we could say is that governments generally are very reluctant to disclose embarrassing truths. whether it's America in 1979 with the 3 Mile Island situation, even democratic governments are very reluctant to give up very sophisticated technological kinds of information like this. Secondly, it's even more so in terms of the Soviet Union. Secondly, in terms of secrecy and the control of the news, really goes back to the czarist history in the Soviet Union, and those people who have absolute power have a real disdain for public opinion. So this even furthers the problems. And finally, in terms of the media, in the Soviet Union, they do not have an independent adversarial institutional setup. So if you take all of these kinds of things, given the sophistication of the technology, which I, of course, know very little about, these things were not probable. These things were events of the past.
John mentioned 3 Mile Island, Ruth. Obviously, the comparisons were made immediately. There are some comparisons, but there's some very real differences in the construction of these plants, are there not?
Yes. All our civilian power reactors are surrounded by an enormous concrete dome whose major function is to keep radioactive elements inside the dome in case of a bad accident. The Soviets didn't have that dome. Not only that, but their reactor was built out of graphite. And once graphite catches fire, it burns at enormously high temperatures. So they got not only a nuclear accident without a containment dome over it, but also a very, very hot graphite fire burning inside the reactor. So they were fighting a hot fire in a radioactive environment, which is just nasty to deal with.
Ruth, don't you think the other thing is that when people talk about radioactive decay and these elements decaying, they always think about the particles and the gamma rays and so on, but they don't think about the fact that as they decay, that energy ultimately is going to be dissipated as heat, so that it's not just the fire burning, but also this reaction out of control that's giving up a lot of heat.
That's right.
That contributes to the whole problem.
I think you need to understand, though, that we're dealing with a chemical explosion and a chemical fire, not the energy that's released in an atomic bomb.
Right.
It's not a nuclear explosion. It's a regular old garden variety explosion contaminated with radioactivity. And there is a difference. A nuclear explosion would have been much larger and would have
Immediate deaths and obviously a lot.
That's right, and it would have spread the radioactivity over a much larger area. So thank goodness that did not happen and could not happen.
Well, that I guess the comparisons between the 3 Mile Island or the typical reactor in the United States, the plant, and that in the Soviet Union, is that what happened in the Soviet Union in terms of the problem could not happen in the United States because the plants are different structurally. Is that correct?
No.
No?
It could happen here. Our safety standards are much higher than in the Soviet Union, apparently, as far as I know. And it is, I think, less likely that such an accident could happen here, but it is not impossible.
You know, I think to point that up, I saw a cartoon in the Chicago Tribune just recently, and they had this couple saying, well, we know this couldn't happen here in this country, and then they said, well, we also knew that the shuttle would not blow up, and then the last part of the cartoon was the family was going to sell the house. So I think the thing that has happened oftentimes is that because of the American bias against the Soviets, we tend to end up to bash the Soviets, so to speak, and I really think the focus we want to look at is what can we in our society learn from this awful tragedy.
I'd like to make a point, and that is that at 3 Mile Island, at least, and from what I read about the Soviet tragedy, the same thing happened here. The problem was in the man-machine interface. 3 Mile Island had failures both of technology and of operating personnel. And what little I know about the Soviet accident, correct me if I'm wrong, Alice, they had the same kind of problem.
It was a human error played a part in it. Is that?
Apparently.
Apparently, they say.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the Western perception of Soviet safety, and from all we read and all we know, is that, in fact, the Soviets have taken a number of shortcuts in terms of safety in these nuclear reactors, and that seems to be as you mentioned, a real difference between our reactors and theirs?
Well, safety costs money. The minute you put a safety precaution in, you up the cost of your reactor. Every time you inspect a concrete joint or something, you up the cost. And therefore, it's uneconomical to take large numbers of safety precautions. The better you train your operating personnel, the more it costs to hire them. It's that simple.
What are we talking about physically now in terms of containing the problem? I read about tons and tons of concrete and basically covering this plant.
I know of two things they're doing. The first thing they had to do was get the fire out and prevent it from spreading to other reactors in the site. For a while, there was a very real danger that the heat from the fire in the first reactor might ignite the second reactor, which was very close to it. And thank goodness that didn't happen. So now they have a molten core, which is white hot, a smoldering graphite fire, and the whole thing is sitting on a concrete slab. They are very concerned that the molten core may be hot enough to eat its way through the concrete slab and into the groundwater. And they are drilling holes under the slab and pumping liquid nitrogen, which is liquid air, very cool, in under the slab to keep it from melting, to keep the core from going into the ground. Meantime, they're trying to get the fire out by dumping water and sand and concrete on top of the fire. They're afraid to use too much water because steam explosions can further spread the core over the countryside. So they have a really nasty problem. I hope to goodness they can get the fire out.
One scientist's opinion piece was that we needn't be alarmed, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't learn something. From what you said earlier, perhaps, Alice, we ought to be a little bit alarmed.
Well, I've felt for many years that we need to be not alarmed, but we need to be more cautious. I think as we're talking about the safety precautions that we can take, you can take safety precautions. You can try to be sure that you are guarding against every eventuality. But when you have human error, when you have the kinds of things that may happen, we're dealing with something that could be rather much more catastrophic than even this one or 3 Mile Island. We've actually been lucky. And you can't compare a nuclear type of incident with a tank car of chlorine gas blowing up in Detroit, which I think was one of the comparisons. Somebody said, well, that would be much worse because we'd have more people who would be killed from the chlorine gas. At least the chlorine gas dissipates. But when we're talking about an accident that involves a nuclear reactor that will spew out radioactivity or will fall on the ground, we're talking about miles of fertile soil that probably will not be able to be used because of the problems in the food supply, concentrating the radioactivity in the food supply as it goes through the food chain. I think there are a lot of long-term problems, and we're not just looking at who dies now.
Yeah, I everything. It's not because I'm a political scientist, but everything is political and economic. And to ask Alice's question, of course, Italy has banned some farm products, and the common market has banned goods that are coming from the eastern countries and also from the Soviet Union. Just how serious do you think the radiation is that's getting to places like Italy or Yugoslavia? Is that going to be a lasting impact? Because if it is, I think that has a direct impact in terms of how serious the politics are for the Kremlin.
Yeah, I think you're going to have a lot of economic implications on that, because I'm not sure if they're banning everything because they're trying to teach them a lesson, so to speak, or if they really need to ban all of the foodstuffs. In other words, it may be overkill. There should be some ways of being able to monitor the foods that are coming in so that they can be selective, to say that we're not going to accept any food from any of this area because of the radioactive problem. To me, seems to be the kind of approach that too many governments, including our own, use on problems. It's all or none. But I think they should be able to monitor. I think they do need to monitor very carefully, especially things like milk, leafy vegetables, and so on, but not necessarily plow under everything in sight. But they may find that there are some of these areas where we will never in our lifetime be able to use the foodstuffs from.
You know, I think perhaps one of the questions that our listeners our viewers may be asking is, what is going to be the political impact of all this in terms of diplomacy? I think we can look perhaps at two examples, one of which was in 1968 with the invasion of Czechoslovakia. I mean, that had a long-term impact. Whereas in 1983, the Soviets shot down the airliner. I think the real question is just how seriously, if that's the word, will be the economic impact of this upon the rest of Europe, and that may tell us just how, what kind of implications the Soviets are in for in terms of their diplomacy.
It's awfully hard to say how badly contaminated the agricultural land around the reactor will actually be. It depends on things like how high the plume went, how big the explosion was, where it rained.
Or if it's closer, further away. It may be that very close. They're actually in better shape than they are a little bit further away.
If the plume was high enough and the wind carried it, which direction and how quickly, that in fact there was really no danger, and you're saying then perhaps close to the plant in the
I didn't
but those who were not affected by the explosion might not have been affected by the radiation quite so much.
No, I'm saying that I don't think that there's a linear relationship between nearness to the explosion and the amount of contamination in the foodstuffs or the soil. That you may actually find that there are some places that are relatively close that actually may not be as contaminated as a place that's a little bit further away. I was in Los Angeles last week at some meetings of American Cancer Research meetings, and talked with a physician from Sweden, and commented on the fact that it must be interesting times in Sweden right now with a problem with radiation. And his comment was that he didn't know any more than we did, really, but he understood that the radiation had been detected in Finland before it had been in Sweden, but the Finns had not felt that they could politically disclose this. Now, of course, this is just one person's view, but from a safety viewpoint, that's interesting.
Of course, the point you're making is that Finland has a very sensitive relationship with the Soviet Union going back to 1905 and that war, and so that's a very difficult issue for them.
Right.
Well, political fallout nationally and internationally gets into, obviously, the debate over nuclear power to begin with. I mean, there are some cautions here, but while those who opposed nuclear power before Chernobyl, before 3 Mile Island, see this as ammunition that we have to be cautious, maybe stop this direction, but is there any real, from the political end of it, real movement in Washington or anywhere to say, hey, it's time to stop this madness? And that's not intended as an editorial comment, but merely as an argument. It's time to stop and move our directions elsewhere in terms of energy, in terms of power.
We haven't built any nuclear reactors for some time. They're just too expensive. I don't think it's even a political or a safety issue. I'm interested in the safety problem. Yeah. But I think it's a matter of dollars and cents. They can create power much more easily using other sources.
As I recall the figures, Japan has about 26% of its electrical power comes from the atom. France has the largest percentage, and that's 65% comes from the atom. So France that's just tremendous. Ours, I don't know what our figure is. The figure for the Soviet Union is about 6.5%.
We're about 10%, I think.
So, and of course, the plant that's closest to Muncie must be the Madison plant, Marble Hill, I think it's been called.
That one was not completed.
It's scrapped.
The one up in Bridgman, Michigan would probably be the closest, wouldn't it, to Muncie?
Right. We get a lot of our electric power from Cook.
That's Cook Nuclear is Bridgman. Right.
That's Bridgman. Okay, yeah, okay. I always think Chicago.
No, Cook Nuclear is Bridgman.
Well, where is this headed, I guess? I mean, you're looking at the Soviet Union, that is the largest oil-producing country in the world, has turned to nuclear power, when in fact oil, obviously, for some time has been used to produce energy, as coal has been. Does this say something about the future of nuclear energy?
I think it says something very profound about the future of oil. We temporarily have forgotten about the oil crisis, but we shouldn't. because we still have very finite supplies of oil and of coal, and we cannot rely for the long run on oil and natural gas as power sources. We're going to have to do something else. And as a country, we're very reluctant to face the issue of what else that's going to be, but we need to do that.
Well, so I was going to say, a country such as the Soviet Union, that is the largest oil-producing nation in the world, obviously leaders there have seen a need for an alternative source, and nuclear energy seems to be the alternative.
But 6.5% doesn't represent very much, considering that these plants they started building these plants in the early 1950s. And in fact, at that time, they were saying that energy is going to be so cheap that you won't turn out the lights. It's going to be cheaper just to leave them on because electricity is going, and my electric bill doesn't say that to me. But I don't think 6.5% represents a big thrust in the direction of nuclear power. I think, too, that the Bridgman plant is going to go offline in the early 1990s. They have a finite lifetime, so that it's not only expensive to build, maintain, but now what do you do with it?
Mm-hmm.
And, well, I think maybe you should take this one, John, but
Okay.
I think as a society we need to look at the energy crisis and admit it is still with us, and undertake some long-range planning about how we're going to meet our energy needs in the year 2000.
It's going to be a political question.
It's,
No doubt.
it's a political question, and our society usually plans by crisis management and not by planning. So I have yet to see us plan for the future by planning, and I don't think it's going to. It's an economic issue, and it seems, I mean, you're the person who's the expert on this in terms of the growth of nuclear plants. Seemingly, this was stopped long before Chernobyl occurred.
In this country, yes.
Yeah. Now, but let me ask this question. Getting away from the domestic use of nuclear energy, what's the impact upon the weapons industry as far as this is concerned?
In my opinion, the weapons industry has had a series of very sharp lessons on placing too much trust in sophisticated technology. Mm-hmm. The shuttle disaster, obviously, well, it shook me, and I'm sure it shook everyone else. Mm-hmm. We knew it was dangerous, but we had forgotten. And since that time, NASA's had difficulty launching absolutely anything. It must make us stop and think twice about using space for weapons. If we can't get anything up there, how can we rely on placing weapons in space? Not only that, but we see with Chernobyl a sophisticated technology that just plain has broken down catastrophically.
Well, we put so much trust in technology and our ingenuity and the innovation of what's going to happen in 5 years that we've come to trust ourselves that technology will take care of that problem in 5 years or 10 years. Are we at the point where we can't trust technology any longer? Is that what you're saying?
I would say very much so. I probably will be knifed by the American Physical Society for saying it, but I really think that the American public believes too much in technology. It is not the solution to all possible problems, and there's increasing evidence of that in many, many aspects. For example, in medical technology, there's increasing evidence that we need to worry about diet.
Well, I think we have too much, on the one hand, have too much trust in technology, and on the other hand, are too skeptical about technology. We're really not technologically literate. But also, as we look at the kinds of things that we can get from technology, and especially if we're talking about, for example, arms, weapons, using nuclear weapons, nuclear power, all these things, we lose sight of the fact that there really is a problem as far as people are concerned. And when I started out saying that we don't know what the effects of radiation are on individuals, our problem is we're looking at down the road. You know, what is going to happen to a person, their probability of cancer in 20 years. We forget about 20 years from now, and we're not even focusing on these probabilities and dangers. So when we talk about how are we going to satisfy our energy needs, maybe we need to take a look at what do we need and how can we supply true needs instead of, wants versus needs.
Yeah, I think in a way this event has drawn us all closer together, but it's still a problem in terms of how do you get societies to open up that have not been open before. If you've had a chance to travel in the Soviet Union or in the Eastern countries, they are very much less developed societies. than the technology sophisticated West is. And I think they have this deep insecurity in terms of opening up, and how you get societies, nations, after all, as I've said before in this program, seem to have interests, not friends. It's economic interest that the West Europeans are concerned about, not about being friendly with the Soviet Union. So this is, this is an economic interest issue, not an issue of friendship. You may disagree with that.
No, I would tend to say that we are.